Welcome to the Book and Author Talk from this year's National Academy of Sciences meeting. I'm Diane Griffin, Vice President of the NAS and Chair of the Committee on Scientific Programs. And today I have the privilege of introducing this year's Book and Author Talk that will be given by Carl Zimmer, a science columnist for the New York Times and an adjunct professor in the Department of Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry at Yale. As a little bit of background, Zimmer earned a BA in English from Yale and began his career at Discover magazine, where he became senior editor before turning his attention to writing books about science. He's author of 13 books and has won numerous honors, including the AAAS Cadley Science Journalism Award 3 times and the National Academies Communication Award twice. It is the 2019 Academy's Communication Award for Best Book that brings him here today. And the title of the book is She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Powers, Perversions, and Potential of Heredity. Welcome, Carl.
Thanks so much, Diane. Appreciate it very much. So I want to talk to you today about heredity, which, in the world of science is kind of something that we don't need to define. Everybody knows what heredity is, or at least they think they do. If we could turn on my slides, I can share them with everyone. I'm just going to assume, there we go, great. So heredity is not just something now that we all talk about. How common is it to say, oh, you have your father's eyes or your mother's laugh or what have you. Heredity has turned into a very intimate kind of business. Here is just an article from a couple years ago about how DNA kits to find out about your ancestry were becoming a hot Christmas gift. We would have ads where you could get to bond with your family more if you bought a 23andMe kit. And in the corner there, understand your DNA, that's an ad from the Super Bowl. So clearly this whole scientific approach to heredity has become this incredible consumer phenomenon. And the numbers are really kind of amazing. This is a graph that Technology Review put together going through 2019. And you can see that back in 2013, pretty much nobody had gotten a look at their DNA through one of these services. By 2019, it was well over 25 million. It's been continuing to increase since then. So what do people find out when they take these tests? What are we learning about the DNA that we inherited from our ancestors? Well, it's kind of intense sometimes. So, for example, here is a sample slide from 23andMe. If you choose to find out about whether you have a variant called E4 that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. So if you don't have that variant, does that mean that you don't need to worry about Alzheimer's disease? Well, you can see there's a lot of fine print here. And so we are having to deal with this kind of information just on our own. No doctor, no genetic counselor. It's just you and this thing that you bought. In addition, you can find out something about your ancestry. Now, you might get a map back that looks like this. So what are you to make of that? What does that tell you about who you are and how your ancestors made you who you are? It kind of looks to me like sort of just a lot of random circles on a map, but we really invest a lot into these sorts of results, especially now that these genetic tests are getting combined with genealogical databases online. So, for example, here is an ad from Ancestry, where someone is really excited that they're related to George Washington. Not even descended directly from George Washington, but that he seems to be a sort of a distant cousin. But this counts for a lot, even though we're all basically cousins when you get down to it. So there are clearly really sort of powerful emotional currents that are driving us towards this information, and we might be hoping for things that just aren't there. And we need to understand what it is that we think heredity is and what we want out of heredity for ourselves and for future generations, because the technology for manipulating heredity is accelerating at an incredible pace. And in 2018, the gene editing technology called CRISPR was first used to alter human embryos. And those embryos eventually developed into babies. They were born. So we have the first genetically altered children among us. And so we have crossed that line now, and we need to figure out what it is, what is our sort of moral view towards these kinds of interventions in the future of heredity. I think it's really important then, in order to think about the future, to look back at the past, because that is where a lot of our sort of assumptions about heredity came from. The word heredity is quite old. In Latin, it was hereditas, but it didn't refer to heredity the way we use the word. It tended to have more to do with the rights that you inherited from an ancestor, property, including other people sometimes, in the form of slaves. There was a sort of a notion you can kind of glean from ancient Greek writers that there are some similarities between the generations, but there was only the vaguest kind of speculations about why that was the case. And a lot of times it had to do with climate, that sort of a climate that made somebody grow up short would make their kids short as well, that kind of thinking. But by the Middle Ages in Europe, you start to have full-time professional genealogists who are drawing trees like this one, which are essentially designed to justify a king having power over a country. They don't just inherit the crown, but you start to see the language of blood. In other words, that they inherited royal blood. So now there's something, it's not just the stuff that you get from your parents, but it's something within you that you got from them, and with some sort of mysterious connection. I mean, obviously, we don't have blood vessels connecting us to our parents, but at least to our fathers. But nevertheless, this idea that a king could pass down a throne to his son through royal blood was a very powerful image. And we still talk about heredity that way. What's intriguing is that, every now and then you see like somebody start to question these ideas and to start to think forward towards how we would think about heredity. And so, in this case, Montaigne, he actually wrote an essay, which is one of my favorite examples of this, in the 1570s. And he wrote it because he was in his 40s, and he was getting older, and he was starting to develop kidney stones, and he was very annoyed at that. And he wrote an essay about it, and it occurred to him that maybe it had something to do with his dad, because his father also had kidney stones. And so he writes, "It is likely I inherited the gravel from my father, for he died sadly afflicted by a large stone in the bladder." But Montaigne is a very perceptive person, and he says, well, wait a minute. My father didn't have kidney stones when he became my father. So he asked, why he was still so remote from the disease. How could the light trifle of his substance, out of which he built me, convey so deep an impress? Where could the propensity have been brooding all this while? And it's such a great question. And I mean, I think that, today's geneticists that's one of the questions that drives them in their work. Where is it, and how does it work? Montaigne didn't get any answers, and it was an incredibly long time before answers started to emerge. And there are a lot of people that I talk about in my book who helped to sort of try to shed light on that. And actually, a lot of the answers first started coming out of animal breeding. So, for example, in the 1700s, there was a farmer named Robert Bakewell, and he became legendary because he produced a new breed of sheep called the New Leicester sheep, which was very tasty and produced good wool, and it was very different than other breeds that came before. And he set out and made it. He found other breeds of sheep, and he would breed them together in a barn where he had no windows because he didn't want anyone to see what his secret methods were. And he became legendary for this. He was once referred to as the man who invented sheep. And, future generations of naturalists were really intrigued by how he had done this. And they were like, well, how did that work? How did you take two different breeds, cross them together, and then produce a stable breed where the lambs inherit the same traits as their parents? And one of the people who was really interested in this was Gregor Mendel. And Mendel decided to try to look at these principles in plants instead of animals. And everyone learns in grade school or high school about how he crossed pea plants together. And so, he was trying to understand, how can you make a new stable cross? And he was really intrigued that he could make these hybrids, and then if he crossed them together, he would get these odd combinations. So this is a classic example where if you have this pink hybrid flower, and you cross them, they look the same, but their offspring have this 3-to-1 ratio of pink to white. And so Mendel thought of this the way we call it today, of dominance, that there was some factor that was dominant, and so that would produce this pink color if you had one copy of it. Unfortunately, Mendel then tried to repeat all of that with a different flower that had kind of weird genetics and didn't get the right results. And so things sort of petered away. Mendel didn't really know what to make of all of this because cell biology was not mature enough. It wasn't until 1900 really that Mendel's work was rediscovered by scientists who had been studying things like chromosomes. And William Bateson, who was one of these people who was involved in rediscovering it, was so thrilled to see how Mendel, he could think about Mendel's work as there being factors on these chromosomes, these factors which would come to be known as genes. And he declared the whole problem of heredity has undergone a complete revolution. He says this in 1900. And that's when he coins the phrase genetics, the term genetics for this new science. Now, this work had been done mainly with experiments on animals and plants. But there were plenty of people who believed that humans follow the same rules. Now, you can do an experiment on humans, but geneticists like Charles Davenport looked at genealogy, at family histories, as a way of possibly doing that. Davenport's a very complicated figure in the history of heredity. He rightly is condemned for a lot of things, but we should also give him credit for the things that he recognized. So just one example, Huntington's disease. This is a devastating disease, causes really terrible neurological symptoms and is fatal. And Woody Guthrie is perhaps the most famous person who died of it. Charles Davenport did a study in Long Island of families where people had Huntington's disease. And he showed that basically Huntington's disease got passed down basically like pink color in pea plants, like Mendel had seen. It's a dominant trait. In other words, if you inherit one copy of this Huntington's version of a gene, you get Huntington's disease. This was a big deal, and it turned out to be right. We know exactly where the variant is that causes Huntington's disease. There's a gene called HTT, and there's a section of it called here the CAG repeat. And if you have a certain number of repeats above, I believe it's 37, you are going to get Huntington's disease. And so we know it down to this incredible specificity. And we know that those repeats alter a protein called huntingtin, which is produced in the brain. And so, Davenport deserves credit for that. Now, it's a century later, we still don't have a cure for Huntington's disease based on that knowledge, but at least if people want to be tested, they can be tested. However, Davenport, he really liked to make these trees, and he would make them for all sorts of stuff. So there was a very famous shipbuilding family called the Herrschaffs. And so Davenport was convinced that he could trace their amazing skill by drawing a family tree and tracing boat building and related talents like artistry or literature in the same way. You know, and he would present this as serious science, you know. Now, we can't help but kind of look at it and laugh a bit at it. Unfortunately, like he would also carry this on to other traits where the outcome was far from funny, quite horrific in some cases. One of the examples I talk about in my book, which I think is really an important lesson for thinking about issues like heredity, like about intelligence, like about genetics, has to do with this man, Henry Goddard, and this school where he was the school psychologist, the Vineland Training School. So Davenport writes a letter to Goddard at the school, wondering if they have done any family studies on their students. These students are what we call, quote unquote, feeble-minded. And that could refer to Down syndrome, epilepsy, or just a kid who was difficult in school. It was a real grab bag, but they would use the same label, feeble-mindedness. Now, Goddard had never heard of genetics before. This was kind of a revelation to him. He had been just recently discovering intelligence testing in Europe, and he was using that to study the children at the Vineland Training School. And soon his testing was adopted by school systems throughout the country. So IQ testing and standardized testing in general in the United States, Goddard is the one who really pioneered it. And now he discovers genetics, and Davenport is wondering if people might inherit a gene for feeble-mindedness. So he sends out people to go interview the families of his students and also try to work back in their genealogy. And he finds hundreds of examples that he's convinced show that it is genetic to be feeble-minded. And the one that he really singles out has to do with a girl named Emma Wolverton. So on his intelligence test, she tests a little bit below average. And he comes up with a name for people like her, moron. So Emma Wolverton is the first moron. And his genealogists come back and tell him that come back with this crazy story. It turns out to be totally wrong. But anyway, he believed it, that one of her ancestors, shown here in this tree, Martin Kallikak in the middle there, that he slept with a nameless feeble-minded girl and then produced this long line of feeble-minded descendants. When he wrote about Emma Wolverton, he referred to her by the name Deborah Kallikak to protect her identity, even though he would show photographs of her. Anyway, then Martin Kallikak marries the lawful wife, and they produce lots of upstanding citizens for generations. Now, you know, if for the scientists who study these sorts of things, you might just be mind-boggled that anyone would take this seriously, but Goddard certainly did. He said the biologists could hardly plan and carry out a more rigid experiment. And this is from a book he wrote called The Kallikak Family. And he thought that this data was among the most valuable that have ever been contributed to the study of human heredity. So, you know, Goddard is really convinced by this, and he's not the only one. Goddard becomes incredibly famous for this. There are lots of think pieces about this. Basically, this becomes a solution to the crisis of poverty that the United States is dealing with. It's industrializing, the cities are growing, there's crime, there are slums, and now the middle class, upper class can look at the downtrodden as just having bad genes. You know, but there's also this sort of sinful kind of echo, like that, so that you see this headline, for example, how one sin perpetuates itself. So that people who are feeble-minded and also criminal, it's like this legacy that they can't escape. Goddard was invited to Ellis Island to screen immigrants for these exact sort of traits. This influenced the immigration policy in the 1920s, which basically viewed Italians, Jews, and Russians as mostly being feeble-minded. So, and if that wasn't bad enough, Nazi biologists, they took a lot from Americans like Goddard. And so this is a still from a movie that you can actually find on YouTube, Das Erbe, German for Heredity, and it would be shown in movie theaters, sort of an educational film. And so, it's basically structured around a young woman, a student who is asking an older man, the scientist, all these questions about heredity. What is heredity? And he talks about Mendel, and he talks about flowers, and he talks about horses and puppies, and everything's fine until the subject turns to people. And then they show this. This is a German version of Henry Goddard's tree. And they're presenting this as proof that feeble-mindedness is inherited, and that if anybody is identified as being feeble-minded, they need to be prevented from having children. In the United States, Henry Goddard and others pushed through sterilization laws. So tens of thousands of people in the United States were sterilized thanks to the work of these scientists. And then Nazis took this to an even greater scale, sterilizing many more people and then moving on to extermination. This isn't like there's some sort of similarity between American eugenicists and Nazi biologists. The connections are clear. You can see them in things like this. And we need to really remember the dangers of this, especially because, one thing that's really striking is that, one thing that's really striking about this is that all of this happened when people didn't really know very much at all about heredity. So they knew about genes, but they didn't know what genes were made of. If you had told Bateson, genes are DNA, he would look at you kind of funny because he just wouldn't really understand quite what that meant in the level of detail that we do now. Bateson thought that, that there was a revolution in 1900. I would argue is about maybe 100 years off. It's when we're able to sequence DNA on a large scale, like being able to do the first human genome, that things really change. Now, in 2000, that first human genome, it cost about $3 billion. And so it wasn't something that, was going to be a consumer product, obviously. But the cost of sequencing DNA, either little bits of it or the whole genome, if you want to be more ambitious with it, has been falling dramatically. This is a chart from the National Institutes of Health showing how it has fallen. This is logarithmic, you have to remember, so that now we're down to under $1,000, and people are expecting another fall pretty soon. We're going to be getting down to just a few $100s. So people are then able to get tests from places like 23andMe through genotyping, where you look at maybe 1 in 1,000 genetic letters. It's a little harder to get your whole genome, but I had an opportunity to get my genome sequenced, and by hook and by crook, I was actually able to get all the raw data. And so in part of my book, I talk about trying to look at my genome to understand things that I have inherited, and to understand my ancestry through this gigantic spreadsheet. This is my brother Ben, and he had gotten his DNA sequenced through, I think, Ancestry with genotyping, but that was enough that we could compare our DNA with the help of Yaniv Ehrlich and others at DNA Land. And these red parts are the parts of our chromosomes that are identical. And so, that's a lot of identical DNA, and that you don't get that unless you're really closely related. So if we had any doubt, we are brothers, which is good to know. But in addition to that, I can look at other relatives. This is not my brother, but it's a pretty good likeness of an ancestor, a Neanderthal. Neanderthals are in the fossil record from about 200,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago. And it turns out that to larger or smaller extent, pretty much everybody on Earth has some Neanderthal DNA. Europeans and Asians and people in the Americas have large amounts. People in Africa have a smaller amount. The reason for all of this is that Neanderthals and the ancestors of modern humans shared the world at the same time, and they came into contact. Our species evolved in Africa and then moved out, expanded out, and encountered other kinds of humans and interbred with them. And these arrows are just a few of the exchanges of genes that happened when these different kinds of humans interbred. So, with some of these services, you can find out, do I, what's my percentage of Neanderthal DNA? Am I 1%? Am I 2%? I was actually just curious, well, what are the genes? And so I got some help from Joshua Akey and Selena Badahill at Princeton. They took a look at that genome I showed you, and they gave me a list of Neanderthal genes, which is pretty amazing. This is just the start of it. It's hundreds of genes long. And of course, I look at a list like that and I'm like, wow, well, what's FGR? What does it mean that I have FGR? In a lot of these cases, we don't actually know what these genes do. And even when we know what they do, we're not really sure what they're up to. And it's possible that Neanderthal genes are important to our immune system. Maybe they influence our brain, but very preliminary studies, very small studies on those findings. Just this past week, there was a really big study where scientists looked at 27,000 people in Iceland and looked at all of their Neanderthal DNA and tried to see whether there was any strong connection to really any trait at all that they could measure. And they pretty much, the answer was no. If it was slight, if at all. Now that might be surprising to you. Like you might think if I have a Neanderthal gene, I must be Neanderthal in some profound way. But the fact is that for a lot of our traits, that's just not how things work. Mendel opened the door to understanding heredity in terms of genes, but if you just think of a trait being controlled by a single gene, that's going to lead you awry. One of my favorite examples is height, and I talk about height in the book. Scientists have long been fascinated by height. Mostly, they tended to look at the outliers, why it was that people were really tall or really short. But there's a whole range of heights in between, and height is what scientists call very heritable. In other words, short parents tend to have short kids, and tall parents tend to have tall kids. So there's something going on with the genes. In my book, I talk about Joel Hirschhorn, and he's a pediatric endocrinologist. And the parents would come in with kids who were, on the short side, and they were concerned about this. And he'd say, well, your kid's fine. Your kid's healthy. This is not a medical condition. And but they would want to know why their kid was short. And he would look at the parents, and there'd be an awkward silence. He'd say, well, you're not that tall yourself, honestly. And they would get into discussions about genes, and they would ask what these genes were, and he didn't know. And that kind of launched him on a career of trying to find the genes for height as a way of sort of understanding how genes influence our biology. It took him a long time and had to look at almost 5,000 people before he found one gene. And this gene, it turns out I have one variant of it that basically is the equivalent of me putting on a very thin pair of socks. So it makes me a little bit taller. And, a fair number of people have this variant. 3 years later, they expanded to 183,000 people and found 180 different genes that had an influence. But all those other genes had a smaller influence on height than the first one. 2014, almost 700 genes now. And then just recently in 2018, a couple of years ago, over 3,000 variants. And that was based on almost 700,000 people. They're going to be going on to looking at much larger groups. We will probably should expect thousands of more sites around the genome that have a faint influence on height. And that's just, height, that's because height kind of reflects a lot of things that happen in our bodies. It has to do with how our cells divide, how our bones lengthen, how our muscles keep up with it, when we stop growing, and what signals cue that. So height is something you can measure very simply, just with a little tape measure, like the man on the chair, but it turns out to be incredibly complex. And, we also need to just remember that, just because a trait is influenced by genes, in other words, that it's heritable, doesn't mean that it is fixed by the genes. And it doesn't mean that we should always just resort to a gene-based explanation, because we'll get in trouble again. So here we have some data from Canada and Barbados of the average height of women. So there's a pretty substantial difference here, about 5.5 centimeters. And so you might say, like, oh, well, women in Canada must have a certain set of genes that makes them taller than women in Barbados. The catch is that this data is old. It's from 1896. And if you jump forward 100 years, both countries have taller women on average. And the women in Barbados are now taller than the women from Canada. And the reason for that is that worldwide, quality of food has improved, medicine has improved, a lot of things have improved. These are social changes. They're not genetic changes. So, you can still, make some predictions about people's relative height looking at their genes, but the whole world is taller now on average, and it doesn't have to do with a genetic heredity. You can think of it as a cultural heredity that is influencing it. So just to wrap up, and then I'm happy to take questions. These are a few of the lessons I think are really important to think about now that we're gaining this power to manipulate DNA and to even be able to steer the future of heredity. It is possible to alter genes in a fertilized human egg. And, when you do that, the embryo that develops is going to have all the cells in that embryo are going to have that change, including eggs or sperm. And so, in other words, that if that embryo becomes a person, then that person may be able to pass on those changes to future generations. This has been a thought experiment since the 60s, as I write about in my book. And then in 2018, it became a reality of sorts when He Jiankey, I'm mispronouncing his name, I apologize. He announced that he had altered the DNA of some human embryos, and there were at least 2 babies that were born with these changes. He claimed that he was doing this to make these children resistant to HIV, but as far as scientists can tell, he was quite reckless and probably introduced mutations that were not what he had even intended. He was charged by the Chinese government, and you might think, well, that's the end of it. We'll never see that again. And obviously, in the world of COVID-19, we're quite distracted from these sorts of long-term issues. But we need to bear in mind that this is not going away. In 2019, a Russian biologist, Denis Ryabkov, said that he was, exploring the possibility of doing exactly what had happened in China, or maybe he was starting to canvass parents who had a hereditary form of deafness, saying, do you want your child to have altered genes so that the child will not be deaf? this raises a lot of complicated issues. Do we consider deafness a disability? Or, if you talk to the deaf people in the deaf culture who have their own language and so on, they don't see it like that at all. Are we going to make shortness a pathology? What are we going to decide is disease, and what are we going to decide is health? Now, you might argue that maybe we should be using CRISPR to basically sort of protect future generations from diseases like Alzheimer's. I don't think anyone would argue like somehow that Alzheimer's is not a disease, not a pathology. It's devastating. It causes death. It causes dementia. And we're learning more and more about variants that may protect from Alzheimer's disease. One of them is a variant of a gene called Klotho, and this is just one of many recent papers that have come out looking at how it can protect from Alzheimer's disease. But there's something else about it too, which is that it's also, there's some experiments that suggest that it can actually enhance learning and memory when you're younger. So, you may not be able to have that sort of protective sort of medical treatment without this more problematic enhancement. Do we feel okay with people being enhanced in this way? If people say, well, only the rich people will get it, would you feel okay if it was just available to everyone? I think some people would still feel uncomfortable about it. And just sort of to wrap up now, I mean, I would say as we wrestle with these questions, and we will be wrestling with these questions for decades to come, we should think about history. We should think about someone like Emma Wolverton. So Emma Wolverton, she was examined by the leading scientists of her day, and based on the new science of heredity that everyone thought they understood, she was judged unfit for ordinary life, and that it would be a terrible thing for her to have children. After she grew too old to be at the Vineland Training School, she was moved across the street to an institution for feeble-minded women, where she spent her entire life. She was not feeble-minded. She did all sorts of things. She produced plays. She made clothes. She played the cornet. She taught herself how to make cabinets and wooden boxes. She was a really remarkable person, but she herself became convinced that she was not fit for society. In her 60s, she was offered the opportunity to leave her institution, and she said, "No, I guess it's just not for people like me." And that was one of the biggest tragedies of how science can be misused of our century, that kind of treatment of people. So as we go forward into this strange new future of heredity, I hope we all can keep Emma Wolverton in our thoughts. So thank you very much. I talk about this and a lot more in my book. So if you're curious, you can check that out, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Hey, well, thank you very much. And it was a fantastic talk. And anybody who hasn't read the book should definitely head out and get it and get even more interesting information. We have one question on from the web that's kind of relates to the last part of your talk, but which is, what are the current watchdog procedures regarding human genetic, they say testing, but specifically referencing the recent Chinese activities with CRISPR? And so how is that being regulated these days?
It's a real patchwork of regulation, and it's, in the United States, it's not, that research along those lines is not permitted, but, there's no saying that people might not go to another country to get these kinds of opportunities. The National Academy of Sciences has actually produced a number of important reports on this, and has, I would argue, has left open the door to the possibility of germline intervention in certain cases where there's an inherited disease and there's really no other way of dealing with it in order for parents to have children. But I think it would be very rare cases where some other approach couldn't be used instead. The fact is that at fertility clinics, for example, there are parents who have conditions like Huntington's disease where they are picking embryos in order to avoid their children inheriting their disease. So they may not be rewriting the DNA, but they are intervening, and that is a big deal.
There's a related question, which is about any research into epigenetic editing to alter this type of disease.
Yeah, but I have a chapter on epigenetics, and it's an amazing, fascinating area. I was trying to convey with height just how complex genetics can be. The genetic inheritance is really, it's a lot more complicated than we may have given it credit for. And that's stuff that scientists have been studying for over a century. Epigenetics is even murkier, I would argue. So epigenetics is basically has to do with the molecules that control which genes get to be used, and that's very important for us during our lives. And it's one, for example, why your cells in your eye are different than the cells that make hair, even though they all have the same genes. Now the question is, are any of those molecules able to be passed down to the next generation? That's a huge area of debate and research. And there are some great examples, but they have to do, for example, with plants or tiny little roundworms. The evidence from humans is much less and much more hotly debated. But obviously, because it's humans, people want to know about it. So I don't think answers are going to come very quickly, because when you get to mammals, this kind of research on epigenetics and the inheritance of epigenetics is really hard to do. It's really hard to reject other interpretations of the patterns we see. So I wouldn't hold your breath for that side of things, but it is fascinating.
Okay, thank you. Another question is I'd like to know what Carl thinks of genome-wide association studies, or GWAS studies, that look at poverty, sex preferences, a number of different kinds of things in GWAS studies.
Yeah, so genome-wide association studies, they're kind of like what I was describing with height. Basically, like you get a lot of people and you look at a trait like height, for example, and so some people can be taller than average, some people shorter than average, and then you look at variants that they have in their genome and you say, are there any variants that are unusually common in people who are shorter than average or taller than average? And you can tease them out. And so, we now have identified thousands of genes that influence height. Now, that in itself is interesting, but if you were expecting some sort of easy answer to what height is, that can be a little frustrating. And there are complex traits like diabetes is a complex disease, and there are genes that influence your risk of diabetes. Scientists have found lots of genes associated with diabetes. That has not directly led to the elimination of diabetes. And so there were a lot of promises made in the 1990s that sequencing the genome would lead to lots of cures. Those treatments are coming, but they're coming pretty slowly. And for the most common complex traits and diseases, we just keep discovering that biology is ever more complicated. So once we get into things like intelligence, which I write about in the book, or for example, educational attainment, then we get into even murkier territory, because what is that connection between a variant and on average people having an IQ score like a quarter of a point higher than average? what does that mean? What is the connection there? And how does the environment influence that or work against that or enhance that?
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I think we've run out of time. So again, we very much appreciate your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Oh, thanks.